Good evening, everybody. James Hancock here. I'm back to review Season 1 of The Boys on Amazon. If you're debating whether or not to watch it, I'll give you my thoughts in broad strokes first, and then I'll warn you before I discuss any juicy details from the plot. If you're unfamiliar with The Boys, the show is based on the comic by writer Garth Ennis and artist Derek Robertson, which ran for 72 issues, ending back in 2012. The show was created by writer-director Eric Kripke, along with producers Seth Rogen and Evan Goldberg. The setting of The Boys is a world where superheroes have been around for quite some time, and they are just massive celebrities backed by these mammoth corporations, controlling every aspect of their branding and how they interact with the public. While the image they project is as wholesome and all-American as apple pie, behind the scenes, superheroes are reckless, dangerous assholes who are just as likely to get members of the public killed as collateral damage as they are to save them. And anytime somebody objects, an army of lawyers and fixers descend on the problem in order to make the problems go away. Out of necessity, Billy Butcher, played by Carl Urban, has assembled a team called the Boys, who do their best to basically keep the superheroes in check and give them a spanking when they get out of line. Their chief adversaries are a team called the Seven, backed by this massive company called Vought. And Vought's goal is basically to have sponsored superheroes in every major city and potentially even the military. What's fun about the premise is how it uses analogs of famous characters to explore scenarios we would never see in mainstream comics like DC or Marvel, or more importantly, in the family-friendly shows and movies based on that source material. The Seven's essentially the Justice League with a few minor tweaks and revisions, but acting out in a variety of extreme ways that we would never see in a show or movie created by Warner Brothers. Warner Brothers would never dream of damaging a valuable brand and franchise like the Justice League by showing us scenes where Superman acts like a deranged psychopath who's perhaps read American Psycho one too many times, and therein lies the appeal of a show like The Boys. When I posted my review of episode 1 a few months ago after an advanced screening, I remember reading some comments where folks were clearly failing to get the joke, complaining that the show is copying characters like Batman with Black Noir or The Flash with A-Train. But that's the whole point of satire and alternative takes on classic characters. Alan Moore's Watchmen featured an entire cast of analogs based on characters from Charlton Comics, which had just been acquired by DC. With the concept of The Boys, we essentially get to see a twisted nightmare world and what a celebrity-driven superhero culture would really look like, where icons like Homelander, who's basically a cross between Superman and Captain America, is essentially the scariest motherfucker on the planet. And without giving anything away related to his character, I'll say that the show is 100% worth watching just to see Homelander in action. Anthony Starr does a brilliant job of the role, leaning into every twisted, diabolical line with absolute relish. His powers look incredible on the screen, but best of all is his really perverse, needy relationship with his boss, Madeline Stillwell, played by one of my biggest childhood crushes, Elizabeth Shue. But as much as I love the Homelander, I do have a lot of complaints about the show. Garth Ennis' original series is the kind of story that employs a style of scandalous humor that very deliberately tries to provoke outrage in those folks who like telling storytellers which words they're allowed to use or which scenarios in their screenplays might be considered problematic. I love Garth Ennis' sense of humor, and I was very disappointed by just how little of it was actually used in the show. I think people who've never read the comic will actually have a much better chance of enjoying the show than those readers who love the source material, or just Garth Ennis' work in general, comics like Preacher or Crossed or The Punisher. The show of The Boys uses a lot of the same characters, but really is quite a different experience in tone and style, especially when it comes to sex and nudity, which is quite pervasive throughout the comic, but virtually non-existent in the show. And while the show does have many scenes that are reminiscent of classic moments from the comic, they've been defanged, declawed, effectively neutered to the point where the show ends up feeling rather safe and politically correct by comparison. If the showrunners want to create a PC show, more power to them. But what I object to is a show that pretends to be provocative and shocking in the most superficial way possible, using things like gore, while very slyly on the side removing any scenes or moments that might potentially incur the wrath of progressive bloggers. Twice now, producer Seth Rogen has done this, where he takes a comic that I love, adapts it into a show, only to chicken out and blink at the last minute when it comes to being faithful to the spirit of the original story. So I think it's fair to say that this season is a mixed bag of good and bad. Some characters and subplots will lull you to sleep, while others will keep you on the absolute edge of your seat. Amazon's clearly very pleased with the show and has already renewed it for season 2, and I did like it enough, in particular the twist ending, where I'll definitely be back for season 2. I enjoyed it, I just didn't love it. But that's as far as I can go without giving away specifics, so if you don't want spoilers, now's the time to run screaming for the hills. So with all that out of the way, let's get into it. The story of Season 1 unfolds primarily from two perspectives: Huey, a recent recruit for the boys, and Starlight, the newest member of the Seven. Huey recently saw his girlfriend murdered right before his eyes when A-Train ran right through her, basically evaporating her right before Huey's eyes, while Starlight, she's a wholesome and principled young superhero who spent her entire life hoping one day to join the world's most famous super team, the Seven. Both characters struggle with some serious doubts over the tactics and the ethics of their organizations and eventually find solace in each other's company, first as friends, then as lovers. I think Erin Moriarty pretty much nailed the role of Starlight. She's strong but somewhat naive and learns through her horror that everything she's been taught about her church, the source of her powers, and the Seven is pretty much a lie. Unfortunately, I was less satisfied with Jack Quaid as Huey. After taking out the invulnerable and invisible hero Translucent by blowing him up with a bomb up his ass, I thought throughout episodes 2 and 3 that Huey's character was starting to turn a corner into becoming someone I could root for. But the problem is that he spends the majority of the season acting as the conscience of the boys, scolding and lecturing Billy Butcher whenever he gets a little too savage for Huey's tastes, which basically ends up making Huey feel like a giant wet blanket whose only purpose in the show is to make the show less fun. To his credit, actor Jack Quaid gives it his all, but I dislike how the character is written in the show, for me making him the show's Achilles heel when he ought to be the show's greatest strength. Carl Urban, on the other hand, is perfectly cast as Billy Butcher, although the show definitely taps the brakes on the more extreme aspects of his character. That said, he's still pretty funny, like in a scene where he explains to Mother's Milk and Frenchie with very specific examples how the boys are basically a vigilante version of the Spice Girls, to which Mother's Milk replies hysterically, "How do you know so much about the Spice Girls?" What totally bewildered me, however, is how the show deprived us of one of the most obvious scenes that should have been included, preferably as the climax of the first season. As we learn both in the comics and in the show, the secret to superpowers is Compound V. And toward the end of the first arc of the comic, basically issues 4 and 5, the boys take a small dose to jack themselves up for a few hours so they can give some soups a proper spanking. The scene is so much damn fun to read and such an obvious payoff for the story, where the boys typically are at a massive disadvantage due to not having any powers. But episode 8 of the show doesn't really have an emotional climax, at least in terms of action. I couldn't believe how uneventful and slow the final episode was, apart from some revelations at the very end that Homelander had a child with Billy's wife, who he has assumed to be dead for the last 8 years. I said it before and I'll say it again, Homelander is the reason to watch this show. Unlike so many other characters, he clings to no delusions whatsoever about what the Seven really stands for. As he says, "I'm the Homelander. I can do whatever the fuck I want." He's delighted to be a corporate animal who's doing everything in his power to achieve Vought's ultimate goal of getting superheroes into the military, including going so far as to give Compound V to terrorists and criminals all over the world so that the Seven will have some proper villains to fight. That's what has me most fired up about Season 2, is seeing the consequences of Homelander's actions. What really caught me off guard, though, is how insanely badass Homelander was when he was using his flight and heat vision. I hope Warner Brothers is taking notes for all their future Superman movies, because this show got champagne for the price of beer. Homelander in action is absolutely terrifying, especially during his coldest moment of the show, where he calmly tells Queen Maeve that they're done with their mission when it becomes obvious to him that due to his sloppiness, there's no stopping a hijacked jet from crashing into the ocean. Admittedly, the scene is 1,000 times more horrifying and 1,000 times more hysterical in the comic, but in terms of Anthony Starr's delivery of the material given to him, he just nails it. So while I might have my own personal gripes, I think there's a good chance that this show will build a pretty solid following, in that it offers scenes that would never be seen in a million years in either the MCU or the DCEU, which are pretty squeaky clean by comparison. A perfect example is the scene where a hero named Popclaw decides to have sex with her landlord instead of paying rent. And as they're exploring this ass-eating fantasy that he has, Popclaw gets a little overly excited and ends up popping the dude's head off like a watermelon right beneath her nether regions, for lack of a better expression. And then you have the mini scenes detailing A-Train's addiction to Compound V, which in the short term maintains his reputation as the fastest man alive, but is slowly weakening his bones, shrinking his balls, and enlarging his heart to the point where he nearly dies from a heart attack while battling Starlight and Huey in the final episode. Perhaps the funniest gag is when the Aquaman analog, The Deep, tries to save a dolphin from a water park, but as he's driving away in the getaway car, he has to slam on the brakes, which sends the dolphin flying right through the windshield into the road, where it's pulverized by a Mack truck. So for that kind of material alone, I think The Boys does have a role to play in our current pop culture landscape. With so many superhero shows and movies being made today, it's incredible to me that more filmmakers don't seize the opportunity to make fun of them, or at a bare minimum, give us some hard art takes that are unafraid to explore dark topics and themes that would scare Disney and Warner Brothers to death. Because as much as I enjoy following franchises like the MCU, a little satire, a little humor, and a little sex and violence goes a long way in just keeping things fresh, keeping things interesting. In conclusion, I'll simply say I am rooting for The Boys. I hope season 2 will be a slight improvement over season 1. I really like what The Boys stands for. I just get disappointed when I see a book or a comic or any kind of source material that's incredibly irreverent, incredibly sadistic, incredibly bold in its creative choices, and then people come along and kind of water it down, dumb it down, or just make it more easily consumable by a larger audience. But I'll be interested to hear what people think. Like I said, I think people who have not read the comic probably will love this show, but for fans of the comic, I think they will come away a little disappointed. In any event, that's all I got for now. So if you want to talk more about comics or Garth Ennis or Derek Robertson, The Boys, whatever, you can find me on Twitter at Colbrax or leave me a comment in the comments below. But if you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing to my channel, liking the video. But I can't thank you enough for giving this video a look. I really appreciate it. But more importantly, as always, onwards and upwards.